All right, hello everybody, and welcome. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good morning to those of you in the other time zones. As we do stretch across, we do have participants from across the country. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jerry Greenspoon. I am the managing partner of Greenspoon Murder, and really a pleasure to be here and share our thoughts, experiences, thoughts, and possible predictions with my colleagues, both at Greenspoon Murder and at the Liaison Group, all experts in the cannabis industry. And we're going to examine the industry through a banking lens today, particularly on the heels of an election where we saw such positive, incredibly large gains for the industry around the country. And before I introduce the remaining panelists, take a moment, I'd like to take a moment to remind you that there is a section on your screen where you can ask questions. You can put those questions in writing. We will see them as panelists, and we will be able to take those questions and answer them at the end of our presentation. And hopefully you may have had your question answered already by then, but we'll be sure to address it. So as I said, I'm Jerry Greenspoon, and I'd like to introduce Safira Galoob she's president of the Liaison Group, a leading advocate for cannabis reform in Washington, D.C. Safira?
Hi, Jerry, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to host you today. You know, as we begin our discussion, I just want you to know that having this conversation at this time with this audience is very exciting because we believe that the content, the policy, the politics, and the personalities that we're presenting today impact you the most, both with opportunity as well as business growth. So we're excited to have you here, and we're excited to get to know you a little bit better. Thanks, Jerry.
And next slide, please. Also joining us on the panel is Matt Ginder. Matt is a partner in the Greenspoon Murder Cannabis Practice Group. Matt?
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here.
And rounding out the panel today is David Mangone. David is the Director of Policy for the Liaison Group. David, say hello to everybody.
Hey, Jerry, thanks so much for having me, and excited for this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, let's take a look at the next slide, please. And Matt, would you like to kick us off and set the stage?
Sure. Thanks, Jerry.
Economic outlook and consumer trends, what you see. Please go ahead.
All right, no problem. Thanks, Jerry. So this first slide provides you with an idea of the size and growth of the cannabis industry in the United States in terms of revenue. So for this year, 2020, cannabis revenue is projected to hit $16 billion. As you can see from just in 3 years, the growth in terms of revenue has doubled. That's primarily due to two reasons. New markets coming online due to state legalization efforts and expansion of existing markets. So in the 2016 election cycle, just as an example, California and Massachusetts legalized marijuana for adult use, as well as Florida for medical use. So as those programs were implemented, you see the revenue numbers being captured in that 3-year window. Looking forward, 10 years down the road, the cannabis industry is projected to hit $81 billion in revenue. Now we know the demand is there for cannabis. It's just a matter of transitioning those dollars from the black market to the state legal regulated market. And we expect the growth to continue at a rapid pace. A big question is how is cannabis faring during the COVID? The answer is pretty well overall. While it's still federally illegal, many jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana are treating cannabis operators as essential businesses. So that's allowed them to continue operating through these tough times, which many other industries have not been able to do. Next slide. So here's a snapshot or a map of the status of legalization across the United States post-election. So following this election, we now have 35 states that have legalized marijuana for medical use, and another 16 jurisdictions have legalized marijuana for adult use. The clear winner of the 2020 election was marijuana. So all of the 6 ballot initiatives across 5 states passed. So I just want to briefly touch on each state that passed this election cycle. So Arizona has had a robust medical marijuana program there. There was an adult use initiative in 2016 that fell just short. This time around in 2020, they got it back on the ballot and it passed by a wide margin. Mississippi, their medical marijuana initiative passed overwhelmingly. Surprisingly, Montana now has will have an adult use program after their ballot initiative passed. And South Dakota went from having nothing to now having a medical and adult use program through the passage of both initiatives in their state. Lastly, New Jersey passed their adult use initiative by a wide margin. And one thing just to keep an eye on is the Northeast region. We're seeing a lot of government leaders in the Northeast, particularly New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and then most recently Virginia, talking about legalizing adult use marijuana through their through their legislature. Now more than ever, there's compelling reasons for them to do so. So just something to keep an eye out is that Northeast region. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. It's amazing that at a time when it's so difficult for voters in this country to agree on almost anything, the one thing that brings voters together, and you can see by the percentages on the last slide, is approval of marijuana cannabis initiatives in each state. Let's shoot to the next slide, please. And again, on that topic, you can see the widespread support for cannabis and look at the statistics that are on your screen right now. 4 million medical cannabis patients in the US. Florida alone has over 400,000 medical cannabis patients. Number continues to grow. Nearly 2 million cannabis patients in California. And an estimated 12% of the US population are actually cannabis consumers. That's 35 million Americans. And basically on a national poll, 68% of Americans support legalization. So the numbers really these numbers are really telling us a compelling story, as you can see. Growth in patients and consumers, really a reflection of the growing popularity and particularly just the acceptance of cannabis legalization throughout the country. So it is becoming a unifying factor, and it's something that we can maybe at least smile about that. And we've been engrossed in the politics and policy of the industry for many years now, and we have had the pleasure of watching the industry take off and continue to remain with the industry because there's still so many things remaining to be done. But cannabis still remains illegal at the federal level. And what this means, very simply, it is still under federal law. It's illegal to manufacture, advertise, sell, even participate in an ancillary manner in those activities under the aiding and abetting laws that exist under federal law, we're speaking. And despite the picture that Matt just described about about 35 medical states and 16 adult use states, including Washington, D.C. So that conflict between federal and state law is still very problematic for the continuing growth of the business. And Safira, let me turn to you and perhaps give us an overview of the major implications that this creates for businesses from a legal perspective and an operational perspective. What's the posture the federal government has taken? What is their posture over the past several years in its treatment of the industry, given these conflicts? Safira?
Thanks, Jerry. And this slide kind of further amplifies all of the activities that could be prosecuted if the federal government actually prosecuted to the letter of the law. And so irrespective of whether or not you're plant touching, and those of you who are in the financial services industry are well versed in the implications of kind of the black letter law against extending service, being a service provider or extending financial services to the cannabis industry stakeholders, it really does, for folks that are, I call Scalian statutory stewards, meaning that they look at the black letter of the law only, it can be a bit frightening. Next slide, please. However, since 2013, the federal government has taken a bit of a hands-off approach to enforcing the current status of cannabis on the federal level. And it did so beginning in 2013 with the Obama administration. And many of you who are new or who've been in the cannabis industry recognize the Cole Memo and the Fence and Guidance. But we wanted to present this for folks who have been watching the cannabis industry a bit at arm's length and who may be unfamiliar with how the federal government interfaces with cannabis industry stakeholders. In 2013, the Department of Justice created a memoranda that is frequently referred to as the Cole Memo, and it essentially directed U.S. attorneys general to prioritize their prosecutions away from state compliant cannabis companies. At the same time, the Department of Treasury created a complementary memo, or a memo that was predicated on the Cole Memo, that actually provided guidance to financial institutions in order to be able to extend services to these state compliant industry stakeholders. As a result, we began to see several financial institutions enter into the space and begin offering banking services to cannabis industry stakeholders. And we're going to be showing you a graph a bit later, in fact, in a moment, about seeing just how many financial institutions have entered into the space. However, those guidance memos, well, actually the Cole Memorandum was rescinded under Attorney General Sessions. Surprisingly, and actually thankfully, Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin decided not to rescind the Fence and Guidance Memo, so it has remained intact. And after having spoken to many of the banks, of which there are about between 40 and 50 who currently have robust cannabis industry portfolios, it is because the Fence and Guidance Memo stayed intact that many of those banks decided to stay in the space and continue to service industry stakeholders. But the Cole Memorandum, even when it was intact, and the Fence and Guidance Memo wasn't statutory, it was guidance. Only through spending bills, specifically our appropriations bills, does the cannabis industry enjoy any protection. In 2014, there was a piece of legislation attached to the appropriations referred to the Rohrabacher Farr Amendment. It is now called the Blumenauer-Joyce Amendment, but essentially it directed the Department of Justice by defunding any activities that interfered with the implementation of state cannabis medical programs only. So this defunding can't spend money to prosecute state medical, extended only to medical. And so really, since Attorney General Sessions has rescinded Cole, the adult consumption stakeholders, those folks have been kind of left a bit in a vulnerable place. However, the federal government has not gone after any of them. There hasn't been any prosecutions of cannabis industry stakeholders who are compliant. And in 2016, we had a Ninth Circuit case that upheld that law and said that the Appropriations Amendment does prohibit the federal government from prosecuting medical cannabis industry stakeholders. So it's been a good kind of starting point, and it's been the point from which we have been building. Before we get into more of those details, particularly in this environment of non-enforcement, I would like to show this audience a little more detail on how the financial institutions have fared, and just to see some numbers on who's been in the space according to FinCEN. Matt, would you walk us through that, and let's take it to the next slide, please.
So every quarter, FinCEN issues a marijuana banking update. So this slide that we're looking at here are graphs from the latest marijuana banking update, which was issued in June 2020. So as you can see from the top slide, there are 695 financial institutions that are actively banking marijuana-related businesses in the U.S. The graph right below it breaks that total down into two different types of financial institutions. So of that 695, there are 510 banks and 185 credit unions that are actively servicing marijuana-related businesses. They don't define actively servicing, what that means, but we estimate that there are approximately 40 to 60 financial institutions that actually have a robust cannabis portfolio they are servicing. This provides a significant opportunity for financial institutions, particularly state and regional financial institutions, to enter this market. Next slide.
On the next slide, on this slide, we're going to turn to politics and policy of cannabis reform. And we're going to start with, as we say on this slide, David, if you can give us an overview on how cannabis did fare in the past election cycle, as well as highlight some of the other areas that you're watching as the next Congress approaches.
Yeah, certainly. And thanks, Jerry. I would like to start out, of course, with Matt touched on the results of some of the state ballot initiatives, but it is really tremendous for the cannabis industry to have gone 5 for 5 in the states that there were initiatives up. This includes deep red states like Mississippi and South Dakota, where the cannabis initiatives there, at least medical, outperformed President Trump by 12 and 15 percentage points, respectively. So I think this certainly adds to the growing list of states, Alaska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, where cannabis can no longer be pointed as a West Coast liberal issue. So seeing the margins that we saw on election night, I think is really encouraging for the future and the progress of the industry. Aside from state level initiatives, I also wanted to flag that in California, commercial cannabis expanded in over 30 municipalities. As many of you may know, the restrictions in terms of local level and municipality level in California had prevented almost 2/3 of the state from having legal sales in their jurisdictions. So local initiatives and referendums increase that number a good bit, and we're going to see some relatively populated counties in California begin cannabis sales in the coming year. So as far as the election in a broader form, certainly the President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris are going to be likely better positioned to shepherd through cannabis reform than the current administration, based on Senator Harris's contributions to pieces of legislation like the MORE Act, and President-elect Biden also has a clearly identified policy platform on his website that lays out a roadmap of where he wants to take cannabis reform. we did see in the House of Representatives a narrowing of the Democratic majority in the races that were designated as toss-ups. Republicans won 27 out of 27. There are still 5 to be called. In California, 2 in New York, and 1 in Iowa. So that will determine ultimately what the margin is for the Democrats. But what this will mean is that as the House continues to consider cannabis reform, they will not have many votes they'll be able to lose in terms of putting policies forward. Senate, we lost Senator Gardner. He had been very vocal for reform. And then right now, as the race stands, Republicans hold 50 seats and Democrats hold 48. We are looking to 2 rough races in Georgia on January 5th to determine control of the Senate. In order for Democrats to win control, they will have to pick up both of those seats, with Kamala Harris being the tie-breaking vote for those decisions. So I think, you know, we also lost some cannabis opponents. Martha McSally in Arizona is a good example there. She had been relatively neutral, trending to pessimistic on cannabis reform, and was replaced by Mark Kelly. So I think looking at the combination of the electoral map as well as the ballot initiatives, we are well poised for more senators and more House members to come on board in terms of reform. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Safira, and we'll jump to the next
slide. There we go.
So I would like to turn now to the piece of legislation that should be on the radar screen of everybody on this call, as well as the entire industry. The Safe Banking Act has been kind of central to our efforts, being the piece of legislation that is really the closest to becoming law and really becoming the trigger for a game change for the industry. To be specific, for those of you who are new to the Safe Banking Act, it primarily serves to create a safe harbor by indicating that solely because a financial institution extends financial services to legitimate cannabis providers, that does not trigger a violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. But it also provides some additional guidance on SARS. It protects insurance companies and a whole other host of clarifying policy for financial institutions. And as Matt indicated earlier, we are seeing a growing number of financial institutions serving the cannabis industry. And with the growth of the industry, that's only going to get more robust. I want to be clear that the Safe Banking Act does not extend any protections for capital markets. Now, we have seen some private investment funds, and there's a fairly significant number of private investment funds in the space who are like many of the financial institutions and banks and credit unions, extending services to cannabis industry and the businesses that support the industry, but they're doing so kind of balancing that risk with the rewards. So as more and more businesses step in, I think that it will continue to place pressure on regulators and policymakers. And we're seeing that, next slide, please, likely come to fruition in the upcoming COVID package. So as those of you who recall, safe banking advanced out of the House a year ago, September, and it wasn't an insignificant vote. In fact, it was 2/3 voted in favor, including the minority leader and 91 Republicans. And while it did not advance in the Senate under Chairman of the Banking Committee, Mike Crapo, we were very successful beginning this last spring when Speaker Pelosi first included the entirety of the Safe Banking Act in Heroes 1. She later, during the negotiations of the COVID package, included safe banking in Heroes 2. And much to our very kind of relief, Leader Schumer included safe banking in his version of the Democratic package for COVID. So at this point, we have had 4 kind of official victories for SAFE. Where it sits now is right now the COVID package is in the process of negotiation. As of late, as of yesterday, Speaker Pelosi sent a formal letter to Leader McConnell, requesting that he return to the negotiating table. But even if he does not during a lame duck, we would expect that Speaker Pelosi would advance the HEROES Act. We learned from President-elect Biden that it is the HEROES Act that he would support moving into, through both chambers and onto his desk. And so if the HEROES Act proceeds and becomes law, the Safe Banking Act very, very likely stays in, and we get safe banking first quarter of next year. So it's a pretty exciting time for our industry. The momentum is building. It is not a matter of whether, it is a matter of when, which is why I began my remarks as it's such an important and timely time for the audience on this call. So in addition to the Safe Banking Act, we have additional movements of pieces of legislation on the Hill. And I'm gonna let David take over for a moment and talk about the MORE Act and the appropriations amendments. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Biden administration coming into office in January. David?
Sure, and thanks, Vera, and apologies again about the, but we are seeing movement in terms of other cannabis reform legislation. The most significant of which is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, or the MORE Act for short. This is a bill that would remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, reinvest into communities impacted by the war on drugs, institute a 5% excise tax at the federal level, and work with states to incentivize criminal justice programs and repair programs through community reinvestment. So this bill was originally scheduled for a vote before the election. Due to the requests of moderate members, it was pushed. Many of those moderate members actually ended up losing their seats in these toss-up races. And an interesting fact is that of the co-sponsors of the MORE Act, none of them lost their seats. So I think that is a conversation for the larger priorities of the Democratic Party and their leadership in terms of which issues they want to prioritize, but certainly interesting nonetheless. So that vote will be scheduled in early December, likely the first week. And it will be the first time since the Controlled Substances Act passed where members of Congress will be on record on a bill that deals with the de- or rescheduling of cannabis. So certainly identify who is a congressional champion and then who is perhaps hesitant to embrace larger cannabis reform. Its pathway in the Senate is certainly difficult, if not impossible, based on the current Senate control with Republican majority. It still faces a difficult pathway if Democrats are able to pick up both seats in Georgia. But it will start to serve as a benchmark for legislation that comes out of the House in terms of what they want to prioritize in terms of cannabis legislation. So in the future, certainly be mindful of legislation that deals with descheduling, that deals with criminal justice reform, and deals with community reinvestment. The other vehicle that we move from year to year is the appropriations process. As mentioned at the beginning of this call, there's currently a Department of Justice rider that prevents the DOJ from interfering in state legal programs. There's been efforts, particularly in the House, to expand that provision to include all legal cannabis programs, not just medical. The House has also passed provisions that are similar to the Safe Banking Act. They have a little bit less teeth than the actual legislation and provide a little bit less guidance. They have looked at veterans access both through research and directing the VA doctors to allow conversations with veteran patients, as well as some hemp and CBD provisions. So the Senate released their response to the House Appropriations Bill about a week ago. And within the Senate bills, the only provisions that were carried over were the medical non-enforcement rider that has been in place since 2014, the hemp provisions. There was 2 new provisions in the Senate Appropriations Bill, but they aren't necessarily progressive for the industry. They include adding more cannabis-related questions to NIDA's annual federal drug survey that's issued to 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders in terms of youth consumption. And then there is an additional $5 million allocated for research into hemp-derived CBD. But beyond that, the Senate bill is not as expansive as the House when it comes to appropriations. So party leaders will meet and caucus about the differences between the bills and come to agreement in something known as conference committee. We expect that the provisions that will make it through will only be the medical rider and the hemp language, and then we'll have to turn our sights onto next year for more expansive appropriations provisions once the new administration has been sacked and once we have a better idea of what committee chairs look like. So Safira, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So with what's going on in both chambers, I call it the tale of two chambers because the House side is going to advance very progressive measures with Chairman Gerald Nadler as the head of the Judiciary Committee, through which every major legalization bill will have to go. And depending on what happens in the outcome in the Senate, if McConnell holds, as David mentioned, cannabis reform is going to have a very tough and steep hill. We're looking to the White House and we're looking to the administration. And what we've got our eyes on kind of first and foremost and immediately is who those appointments are going to be in those key agencies who would be in the position to help us reintroduce a Cole memorandum type policy. And what we expect is that there would be the climate and the appetite to create a more expansive document. We're still working on what that could look like, but reinstating the Cole memorandum should not be a big lift and shouldn't be a problem, particularly since it was first introduced in the Obama White House. One of the things that we are mindful of is that what the White House can and can't do. People will say, well, can't the president just make cannabis legal? And the answer is, there is a mechanism and a pathway for descheduling, but it's actually quite onerous. And if we were to walk you through it, it's not likely. It really needs to be a congressional, through the congressional pathway. But the White House could pardon cannabis offenders. We could also see some support for the industry with the SBA. There was a big kind of crisis with cannabis industry stakeholders who were considered to be essential businesses when COVID-19 kind of became a reality in March. The federal government started extending loans and grant money to businesses, but the cannabis industry wasn't eligible. So none of the SBA money can go to cannabis industry stakeholders because the banks aren't legally allowed to kind of operate those loans. So this could be a mechanism to help facilitate and further the climate of support. We could also see some agency memos in immigration. Right now, there's some pretty disconcerting policy around business people coming in for the purpose of cannabis, and we've heard some pretty atrocious kind of stories about Canadians being kind of cautioned that if they try to come in for cannabis business, obviously this hasn't happened in the last 10 months, but they could really lose their right to come out of the country. So we're hoping that we can help educate and advocate for industry to the administration to reintroduce those memos and expand them. Next slide, please. So what does this mean, for this audience at this time? Many of you are likely aware that the American Banking Association has been a key champion for our industry, and they have served on the federal level, really with a key role of, one, not just conveying to lawmakers that safe banking is a priority legislation, but in my role as executive director of the National Cannabis Roundtable, we have participated in several discussions with the current administration on ABA's concern and support of safe banking. But what we haven't really done is seen financial institutions on the local level coalesce around the issue. We do have ancillary businesses who've supported us, the folks in insurance and retail, But there's a real opportunity for you on this call to join your voices and not just, kind of work together for best practices. Perhaps that is in setting policies and operational procedures for those of you who are currently in the industry or looking to get in the industry. But there's work to do on the state level, for example, helping shape laws around collateralization, which is going to make an enormous difference once safe banking passes. And notice I said once it does pass, and I said first quarter, so it's coming quickly, I'm going to project. So those collateralization laws would really help, I think, jumpstart the lending market, particularly if we still have cannabis as a Schedule I. Collateralization is a big issue right now as it relates to lending. But we also think that the state and local banks are in the most, the most convincing position for Republican lawmakers. The future of our economy is in Main Street, and Main Street businesses rely on local banks for their lending. When safe banking passes and cannabis businesses can all cannabis businesses can legally put their money in banks, it's going to have an enormous impact on the balance sheets of banks. And those banks are going to be able to turn around and lend that money out, not just to cannabis industry stakeholders, but to all Main Street businesses. And so we really believe that once safe banking passes, the kind of conduit towards the recovery of our overall economy and financial ecosystem is going to be via local banks represented on this call to really come into this space and be part of the mechanism to lend to local communities and local businesses because of the amount of money that will be available coming in from the industry. And so if it's something you're interested in, we think it's an exciting opportunity to put a group like that together. And many of you were contacted with your relationships with Green Street Martyr, but it's something we would like to talk further about. If you're interested, we can talk more about it on this call, or we can talk more about it bilaterally. But we wanted to introduce the concept on the heels of your hearing that safe banking is just around the corner, and it's going to result in a deluge of cash coming into the banking system. And we want your banks to be able to have this opportunity so you can then turn and leverage that opportunity to your other customers and your communities and to the kind of the economic stability and economic recovery as a whole. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jerry for questions, comments, and feedback, and we'll open the forum. Jerry?
Sorry. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As you can all see, there are a lot of complications involved in this particular topic, and a lot of guidance needed for the banking industry. And so we are really, really glad to have those of you who are on this call. Remind you that there is a Q&A icon on your screen. And if you just click on that, you're able to type in a question, and we, the panelists, can see your question and can hopefully respond to whatever it is that you're requesting. We have received a couple of questions that I think we can respond to, and I'm going to read the first one first to our panelists, which is, coming from one of our viewers, stating, as a bank that does not currently work with cannabis clients, how do you, the panel, suggest to advocate to the bank, or for this individual to advocate to his or her bank, to develop a cannabis practice? It seems so complicated, like a minefield. How do we suggest, as we know that we have been involved in that issue before? And I don't know if Matt, you want to handle that?
Sure. Yeah, I think right now is a good opportunity to start the process of learning and educating yourself about what the current status is. And as Safira mentioned, things may change sooner rather than later with the passage of the Safe Banking Act. So really educating yourself right now, because it's not an overnight process. You're going to want to conduct your own due diligence, understand the landscape, understand what the opportunity is. So, maybe this isn't a one-time conversation. This is the beginning of a process of educating yourself. And Safira, if you want to talk about, what kind of educational tools that you're envisioning.
Well, and I'll say, I actually am glad that, the people who are participating in this call are wondering, what can we do to support their ability to advocate to the stakeholders and decision makers in their bank. And I actually think this is another reason why putting a group of peer financial institutions together, because we're the lawyers and the lobbyists on the group. But if we've got 10 financial institutions who are in different phases, because I could envision, we work really closely with the largest financial institution in Maryland, and I know they're very interested in this. We have 5 financial institutions in Colorado. They're very interested. There's 6 in California. So if we're able to get a group together, then the questions you're going to be asking, how do I get myself in order? Those folks are going to be able to answer because they've walked that path before. So that is this. There's a real leadership vacuum. There's a educational vacuum, and there's a peer support vacuum for financial institutions in this industry. And I'm surprised, frankly, as lobbyists, we haven't organized it beforehand. But I think folks were waiting to see when safe banking was coming, and I'm telling you, it's coming. So it's not whether or not you're going to get into this business, because many of you likely are through ancillary businesses. It's a question of whether or not you'll get into it in a time frame that allows you to take advantage of the growth opportunity.
So I think
that answers the question.
And I think that's exactly one of the objectives of this particular panel, is to be able to put together that group, this specialized group of banking officers and banking executives, so they can understand and be ready for something that will really be very beneficial for their institution, financially beneficial, because it's such that quickly and vastly growing enterprise that doesn't otherwise exist, and it's something that's desperately needed by the industry. I have another question. I believe that, either Matt or David, perhaps, or any one of you. We have a question that's asking, when will we see cannabis on the ballot in Florida for the next election? I guess, Matt, you can describe what currently exists in Florida, just briefly.
Sure. There were 2 efforts, 2 ballot initiatives for 2020 that fell short of making it to the ballot. Those 2 initiatives are currently under Supreme Court review. Those cases are pending. So I think I just actually posted a blog on this. So depending on the outcome of those Florida Supreme Court cases, will really dictate the trajectory or likelihood of you seeing an adult use initiative on our 2022 ballot. Until then, it's unlikely to occur through our legislature due to the composition and our governor's stance. So I think it's yet to be determined, but there are certainly efforts ongoing right now to get it on the 2022 ballot here in Florida.
Another interesting question with respect to our new administration in Washington, and the question is as follows. Tom Angel, who was a blogger or a website that we all follow for legislative information, and many in the industry do, wrote that Senator Cory Booker, in a documentary, stated that Biden's plan to decriminalize cannabis is, quote, not enough. Have any of you heard anything more specific about what we know about a Biden administration and their plan? David, or perhaps David?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start with that. So currently, right now, on Joe Biden's campaign website, he identifies a few priorities in terms of his cannabis policies. The first, it deals with expungements and a federal decriminalization. So his goal is to get anyone who is serving, particularly for possession offenses, particularly minority communities who have been adversely impacted, out of jail and stop prosecutions in that regard. The second is to allow states to decide how they want to determine their adult use policies. And then somewhat interestingly, from a drafting perspective, he is interested in moving cannabis to Schedule II for repurposes, and then, quote, legalizing medical marijuana. So it creates a little bit of a paradigm that is a little bit tough to wrap your head around when you're talking about legalization of medical, letting states decide for adult use. But certainly the contrast between Senator Booker and Joe Biden is Senator Booker has always been at the forefront of progressive policies for cannabis reform, has always been looking to push in the most extensive and expansive way possible to have reform focus on criminal justice parity. So I think with Vice President-elect Harris being a counterbalance to the president's plan for cannabis, will move that policy a bit more in line with what Cory Booker is looking for. Kamala Harris was the chief sponsor of the MORE Act in the Senate, has had a considerable evolution on the issue of cannabis in terms of her progressive stance since her time as California prosecutor. So I think that a lot right now comes down to nomenclature and education. We are very well steeped in the differences between decriminalization and legalization. And I don't know necessarily if the Biden campaign has fully adopted that yet. But Safira, anything you want to add to that before we move on to the next question?
No, I think you've covered it. And I think, frequently the press reports in a way that doesn't really reflect the broader context. We are frequently correcting. And it's not to say that it's wrong, it's just not as precise and context thorough, we'll call it that. So I think you addressed it perfectly.
Okay, thank you. So we have another specific question regarding the states. A preface by saying, as we know, New Jersey is one of the states that their ballot initiative passed for recreational use. And we have a specific question asking about New York State. And the question is, it sounds like New York wants to legalize perhaps as early as April 2021. Can anybody speak to that? If you know what the process would be like in order to do that in New York, and New York already has a medical program, as we know. So the question would be on the expansion of that program into recreational. David,
this is
Sure.
part of David.
Yeah. happy to take that. So Governor Cuomo has confirmed that he wants to include legalization in his annual budget. That is unveiled in January with a deadline of having that budget be passed by April 1st. So this will be the third year in a row that Governor Cuomo has wanted to include legalization. The difference between this year and years past, last year, the legislature was certainly closer than they had ever been, and discussions were going well. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. The shift of the legislature changed completely into dealing with COVID relief rather than dealing with legalization. Another, interesting change is Democrats picked up a few more seats in the state legislature, giving them a supermajority, at least in the assembly. So that will prevent any, I think any effort by Republicans to stop legalization from moving forward in New York. And, I'm never one to talk about likelihoods in a mathematical sense, but certainly with New Jersey passing their adult use initiative, there's going to be a lot of pressure on New York to prevent their consumers from going over the bridge to New Jersey to buy legal cannabis. That's a lot of tax revenue that the state would miss out on. And especially as New Jersey's slated to vote on their implementation legislation as early as tomorrow. That means they could have their program up and running through at least existing medical facilities, within 6 months. So I think that puts a lot of pressure on New York. It puts a lot of pressure on Rhode Island. It puts a lot of pressure on Connecticut to pass these adult use legalization regimes, so they don't lose out on all of their consumers going over state lines and helping the state of New York with their budget.
Here's another interesting question that we received is do any of you have any insight as to what is going on inside the large money center banks, JP Morgan, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, et cetera? Do we know how their policies would change, if at all, if the Safe Banking Act was passed, or are we aware of what they are looking at this time?
Well, I can speak to some anecdotal. I mean, we're not inside those banks, and so I wouldn't ever want to represent what is or isn't happening. But what I can tell you, based on about industry, there are many ancillary businesses and businesses who are part of the cannabis industry ecosystem who bank with those financial institutions. So. And many of them do so knowingly. So there's a lot of inconsistency within the banks. I suspect that even with the safe banking, some of those larger financial institutions will be slower to formally roll out their programs. But mark my word, when capital markets makes its way into this industry, they are going to be racing to this opportunity. And even now, every one of those financial institutions have a very close eyes, ears, and interest in what's to come, because there's so much money sitting on the sidelines waiting to come in. We are projecting, if you just look at what happened in Canada, the total addressable market here, we have a sense of how much investment dollars are going to come in, and those banks want to be a part of that opportunity.
So they're waiting for the opportunity. And I think we only have a couple minutes left to ask this last question, which is kind of interesting. We have some MSO, multi-state operators who are on the webinar today, and can we take a guess? Say what is the best and worst case scenarios, perhaps, that they should be looking at for 2021 as to what may happen? We've kind of touched upon it, so it's a little bit of a summary of what you've been discussing.
I think, and again, I want to be respectful both of time and where we're going with this, and not try to proselytize. I'm from Oklahoma, but I try not to be a weather person and predict. I think the best case scenario is that we see the safe banking pass. Speaker Pelosi, during negotiations of appropriations, if they happen after 2021, does kind of push some of the priorities in the House so that we have protections, not just a medical cannabis industry. Like DOJ defunding is extended beyond medical into adult consumption, veterans access, immigration, some of the other protections that we have in appropriations, those actually make it into the final bill. And we see a really, comprehensive set of agency memorandum that come out of the Biden administration, the executive agencies. I think that is not an impossible outlook, but again, a lot of factors have to come into play. I can assure you, MSOs, if you would like to see these things happen, then getting involved in the advocacy of them would benefit you greatly. And I'm not doing that just because I'm a lobbyist, but I can tell you, you spend your money on insurance policy, you spend part of your revenue on insurance policy, you spend money to mitigate risk. Well, advancing advocacy at this level, at this time, with this level of nuance that we work, is mitigating your risk. And so making that investment is not a throwaway money. It is a return on the investment you've made in your business. Jerry?
And do I have time for one more? I think it could be answered pretty quickly. And it's more about, I think, explaining again a little bit of confusion regarding the MORE Act and its connection or lack of connection to the Safe Banking Bill. The specific question was, is the MORE Act included in the Safe Banking Bill? And I think
no, completely separate pieces of legislation. The MORE Act has not even passed out of the House yet. The Safe Banking passed out of the House by a wide margin and is in the COVID relief packages. The MORE Act has been introduced in the House, it's been voted out of committee, and it is scheduled to have a floor vote early December.
All right. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very, very much. I hope all of you have found this very, very useful. We know that there's great interest by banks, financial institutions to receive this information, and it's for that reason that we created this webinar and this panel. We intend to do more on a regular basis, and but more importantly, we intend to hopefully to hear from you and hear about your enthusiasm in participating in what we would call a banking coalition, solely comprised of those specifically interested or invested in the banking industry, so that we can all work together and advocate. As Safira has said, it will have enormous importance and be extremely effective on the Hill, hearing from their banking constituents directly. We are already working very, very closely with the ABA. We're all on the same team and the same side, and now we're looking forward to working with each of you, with you as a group together. So we look forward to hearing from you. We'll be reaching out to you again. Thank you, and thank you to my all of our panelists, Matt, Safira, and David. Thank you again to our wonderful marketing and events team for hosting this, and we hope to speak to you all again very soon. Take care.
Thanks, Jerry.